our brothers and sisters definitely have spoken on this specific subject many times before here on the URZ and many other platforms as well, but just to put ones up on notice so that they can catch up as well at this point that we have here. The World Economic Forum taking place in Davos at this very moment. I think that they, of course, will end on either tomorrow, just before the Sabbath. But, of course, President Trump and many other officials have made their way, of course, there to Davos, to the World Economic Forum to meet with many heads of state, many of very, very influential people, very intelligent and intellectual people, and many of them discuss a myriad of subjects, speaking on much of what Sister Mariama, myself, and, of course, the brethren Rasiadinos have spoken on, along with many of you in the fellowship as well. And, of course, speaking on things like automation, the jobs market, much of what we see out here in the world as far as politics, not only on these shores, but on an international front. As we mentioned, many heads of state taking place in this specific forum, much like a G7 or G20 meeting on that front, but not so much leaning, so much on the political aspect, more so on the social and economical aspects, or more socio-economic on that sense, just as an overtone, I would say. We've heard from one such as Jack Ma, Emmanuel Macron, President of France, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, of course, even so newly put into place, President of Zimbabwe, Emerson Mnangagwa, has also made way to Davos for the World Economic Forum. Very interesting topics have been brought up, and even so specifically, a lot of what we speak on, especially with the technology and things that are coming forward now, much of the social issues that have gone on, especially between the sexes on that sense, has been a hot-button issue. But probably one of the most has been the technology that has been coming forward, much of the geopolitical shifts that are taking place at this specific time, and also the technology as far as monetary policy. So cryptocurrencies, for all of I Wyndham, you speak very oftenly, and we definitely have a little bit more to expound on that in the grace period just before we, of course, conclude here. I can honestly say that so much of what we have heard so far, and ones can research this for themselves as well. Just type in WEF 2018 in your search engines, especially there on the YouTube. I think the World Economic Forum is actually how the channel, of course, is presented, and they have a myriad, like I said, a myriad of subjects, a little elongated, a little dry at certain instances. Again, we have to remember that these are much of what one would coin the more intelligent, the more upwardly mobile peoples of many places, respectively, throughout the world. And they encompassing, many stratas of many of what we would call the upper class, I would say, mostly of the upper class, mostly of the aristocrat classes of certain particular countries, particular places throughout the world, encompassing other places within politics. We mentioned Emmanuel Macron, Justin Trudeau, also President Emerson Mnangagwa, also Chancellor Angela Merkel. Just many ones, just the ones that we, of course, had a chance to get a listen to as far as coming up until this point. And many of the meetings, of course, still taking place at this very moment. So a lot of suggestions on how the world will move forward. It's not so much as condescending as ones might actually think. These people are actually in a place where they're trying, well, at least from my own opinion, I would say, I won't, place it upon, anyone else. But from my own opinion, these ones are actually more so looking to, I would say, make the best educated guess on how the world will move forward. And as far as certain patterns have been shown to form up until this time, which we're living in it definitely narrows the gap and makes less room for error for one to actually get a read on what's actually coming, of course, proverbially down the pipeline, as they would say. But just to put ones up on notice of that also in this sense, the World Economic Forum, again, search that out on the YouTube and throughout your search engines. You'll be able to pull up a lot of good information there. You'll be able to follow a lot of the policy conversations that are going on at this time. So things that you of course, won't hear unless you're actually looking for them intently. So we really have taken, quite a reception in many of the conversations that are being had. Much of what is being tossed around to and fro, thinking of not only policy but politics, social issues, geopolitical issues, and things that, of course, are coming, in such a way that it's more so not reading, but more like analyzing, putting, more of an analysis on much of what we are seeing out here in the world, as we have, of course, spoken on it here, on our platform, on the Cybership Radio. So that really brings out a lot of, things that we didn't notice at first, and also many of the things which we were able to expound on, which we had come across before. So we definitely are interested in expounding a lot more on these topics, learning a lot more, listening a lot more. So hopefully ones will take the opportunity to do so as well. But here we had a specific clip that we had gotten into, and we really, we really started to take notes at this specific point, because this was a very interesting, I should say, panel that was put into place. And here we'll listen to the words of a Tim Snyder, who's a historian. And I forget exactly where he's from. It escapes me at this very moment. My brothers and sisters, as we are presenting here before the eye, because we'll try to expound a bit more on that, moving onward and upward throughout much of what we have to present here. But Tim Snyder discusses much of the potential and probable geopolitical shifts of soft and hard power of certain nations. And he was also on a panel with another one who's surnamed Kaplan, and I forget the young lady's name, of course, who was, I think she's a professor of much religious studies throughout certain history of certain civilizations at specific times. And, I think she actually came out of either UCLA or USC, one of the two, there in Southern California. I think it might have been USC, but of course, ones can actually research the specific panel and the conversation which we are alluding to here, which we only have a clip. We just took a clip out because it was so interesting of what was being said in a follow-up to what historian Kaplan was mentioning. Tim Snyder just hit most of the more pungent points, which we thought were a little more important to something which, of course, we had been alluding to from such a time. And much of what the panel had been bringing forward was speaking on the emergence of Eurasia, speaking specifically of the BRICS nations, which, of course, we've spoken on many times here, and specifically more to China and Russia on that sense, of course, which was the focus of the historian surnamed Kaplan. But immediately following him, you'll hear Tim Snyder speak on, of course, the specific topic which we are bringing forward, and giving a little bit more of an analysis that leaned more to what we had, of course, studied from Scripture, followed throughout certain historic timelines, and, of course, have been seeking to share with our fellowship here and those, of course, who tend to tune into us whenever the time, of course, allows. So you'll hear a little bit of what the one surnamed Kaplan, this historian Kaplan, of course, will be speaking on, which he will be wrapping up just in the first minute, and then immediately he'll go right into historian Tim Snyder. So we'll take a listen here, brothers and sisters. Once definitely get comfortable at this very moment, because this is really going to get interesting, because after really hearing what Mr. Snyder was presenting here, the only thought within Scripture that came to mind was Jeremiah 16, verse 19. Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 19. And it just really jumped out at us. And we, of course, couldn't call the Scripture to mind, at hand, but we definitely had a thought, of course, on the specific topic of that Scripture. And it really just jumped out at us at that moment. So we definitely had to look it up, as soon as possible, and it really kind of came together on our own perspective, at least, from our own listening to this one, Tim Snyder. So we'll take a listen here at the World Economic Forum there in Davos, Switzerland, of course, which will be ending up at this Friday.
In East Asia. And in order to really access the Indian Ocean, the Chinese Navy needs to dominate the South China Sea. And I'll end with this. The Chinese are doing nothing in the South China Sea that the Americans did not do in the Caribbean in the 19th and early 20th century. The American empire of sorts began in the Caribbean by dominating the Western Hemisphere, and the new Chinese empire of sorts begins in the South China Sea to provide access to the Indian Ocean, so China will have a maritime sphere all the way from the East China Sea to Djibouti, where China is building a military installation at the mouth of the Red Sea. And I'll stop.
Robert, many thanks indeed for, I think, taking us around half the world in 20 minutes, which is really quite an achievement. We're going to have, further commentary from our other two speakers. Two very brief thoughts that occurred to me off the back of your comments, and very stimulating way to think about why we should start remembering empires. One is to ask where nation states fit in. The countries you've talked about, Iran, China, and Russia, all, of course, empires that have struggled with their identity as modern nation states in the present-day era, and how that has sometimes been a rather unhappy marriage. And second, of course, one identity that goes right across this region, crossing boundaries, which, of course, is religion. Islam is perhaps the faith that's most obviously thought of in this context, but Buddhism is sometimes forgotten as another one that goes very much across those boundaries too. So I suspect there'll be plenty of grounds for discussion and debate off the back of what you've said. But the thought of nationalism brings me to Tim Snyder, who, amongst other things, is a very distinguished historian of that, but he will, I think, now be responding in his own way to Robert's comments. Tim.
Okay, great. It's a great pleasure to be able to respond to such a fruitful presentation. What I'd like to do is begin with what I take to be an exception to the rule that Bob made, and then work my way back towards the main thrust of his argument. I'm a historian who writes about territory and nation, so I can't disagree with the main point that territory still matters. However, I do think something has changed in the 21st century. There is a way of projecting power in the 21st century that did not exist in the 20th and back for the previous couple of millennia, and that is electronically. It is possible in principle to win a cyber war without any physical or territorial contact with the enemy. And that is something new, and it's worth thinking about. If one considers what Clausewitz says about war, he says the goal of war is to break or to change the will of the enemy. And then he also says, and it's an important qualification, he says, now the way that we do this is by combat on the battlefield. And indeed, for the previous several thousand years, that is generally how the will of the enemy was broken or changed, by combat on the battlefield. But Clausewitz imagines that that might not be the case. Combat is a means to an end. The end is breaking or changing the will of the enemy. With cyber, it is theoretically, and I believe it's now been demonstrated to be practically possible, to change the will of an enemy from a distance without making physical contact. And of course, the great example of this is what I think will be seen as the extraordinary, awful, or splendid, depending on your point of view, defeat of the United States in the first major cyber war of our century in 2016. The result of which is that the President of the United States is the payload of a Russian cyber weapon. That sort of thing could not have, it's funny if you're from where you are, but if you're from where I am, it's less funny. This creates a situation which I think is in fact different. I mean, there are various ways to look at it. One is to think about geography and human contact. If the average American spends 11 hours a day in front of a screen, that's a different attitude to the physical world. That means the physical world is less important to you. Another way to think about this is in terms of ethnic conflict. Traditionally, and this is Rana's question, if you're going to think about an ethnic conflict in Eurasia, you'd be thinking in terms of territories where the minorities actually live. In a cyber war, you can play on a non-geographical ethnic conflict. For example, African Americans and whites in the United States without having any presence on either of the territories. That's now possible and has been proven to be possible. Or by comparison to the Cold War. One of the reasons why the United States did well in the Cold War in the 70s and 80s was that the United States could demonstrably produce physical goods which mattered to people in the physical world. I would suggest in the 21st century that the table has been a bit turned. Russia doesn't produce things that people want any more than it did in the Soviet Union did in the 80s. But the competition is not there anymore. The competition is what the Russians very intelligently call the psychosphere. They can get to a psychosphere, the American psychosphere, without producing anything except images. And so why not? So this is, I think, the exception, which then, in the second part of what I want to say, is going to lead me back towards Bob's argument. And the second thing has to do with Eurasia, not as a place, but as a concept. There's a long tradition in Russia of treating Eurasia as an ideal, as a notion, as a place that Russia might take the world. This begins after the Bolshevik Revolution with certain immigrant thinkers of the 1920s who have the idea that the beauty of Russia is that Russia is Asia. The beauty of Russia is that Russia escaped Greece, Rome, it escaped the Reformation, the Renaissance, the Counter-Reformation. It escaped the Enlightenment. All of this thanks to Asia. This is what the Russian Eurasianist thinkers say. Hence, Russian politics should be oriented towards avoiding all of those things, disrupting them, or destroying them. Now, that is a very strong trend in Russian political thought, which has been revived since the 1990s by thinkers who are important in Russia today. The most important Russian Eurasian thinker was a man called Lev Gumilov, who lived during the Soviet period, who Mr. Putin cites in his speeches. So Mr. Putin brings back into the Russian language this idea of Eurasia. We have to think of Eurasia in this sense as an idea. But I'm agreeing now with Bob, I think, when I say that it's not a traditional imperial idea of creating power or creating order. It's rather an idea which is meant to disrupt and to disorganize, specifically when directed towards the European Union. So Bob mentioned Russian attempts to disrupt in Poland, in Eastern Europe. The same kinds of policies have also been applied in France and Germany and in Scandinavia, not to mention the United States. The interesting thing, and I'm trying to give credit where credit is due, thanks, is the idea that we are going to teach you that the European Union is not really possible. What's real is empire, or what's real is the nation state. When Russia interferes on cyber in Europe, it is almost always on the side of the populists or the anti-EU people who are making the case that we ought to leave the European Union or the European Union ought to collapse. Now, let me say one more thing. So the conclusion, to bring us back to the old world of empire, is this. If you look at this map of Eurasia, you can see some kind of Chinese empire, because the Chinese empire, the tributary empire, was on land. You cannot see the important European empires because they're maritime. Okay, this is a very obvious point, but the idea of the West Europeans going back to empire is a complete non-starter. That's something which, fortunately, is not going to happen. And so when people think of the end of the European Union, what they think of is back to the nation state. And here is the big trap of Eurasia. This is the trap. This is the bottomless pit of European politics. This is the bottomless pit of Brexit. There is no history of the nation state in Europe. The great privilege of Europeans is that they went directly from empires which exploited other people, directly, with no intermediate stage into an integration zone in which they traded with one another. They had the unique privilege in the history of the world of not ever actually having to try to do a nation state, which is a very hard thing to do. They don't remember this because they teach themselves crazy histories about the nation state, which didn't happen, right? Every European thinks there must have been a moment when we were a nation state, and that moment was when they were being mistaught in elementary school. It didn't actually happen in the world of history. And so the deep trap of Eurasia as a concept of breaking Europe down into empires that will never return or into nation states that never were is that there's not a future there, right? That's the way Eurasia works as an idea inside Europe.
Tim, thank you very much.
Whoa, I hope you heard that, brothers and sisters. The most important part of that clip was at least the last 40 seconds of that clip. And I really have to give credit where credit is due also, Mr. Snyder, for actually releasing that truth as a historian and staying true to his craft. As he mentioned, I also concur, especially even from a scriptural position, as I mentioned from Jeremiah 16, verse 19, as it reads, O Lord, my strength and my fortress and my refuge in the day of affliction. The Gentiles shall come to thee from the ends of the earth and shall say, surely our fathers have inherited lie, vanity, and things wherein there is no profit.